Howdy, folks. Welcome back to Steampunk Desperado channel. Yes, I did it. I used the term woke again. I know I said I wasn't going to do that, but it was appropriate here. I know I've used the term too much, to the point where one viewer said, I think the word woke is what you say when you don't like something. Well, not entirely true. There are things that aren't woke that I don't like, and there are a few woke things that I actually do like. One of these is the work of the celebrated yet controversial sci-fi writer Samuel R. Delaney. Recently, I reread his 1975 novel Dhalgren for the first time in several decades. I wanted to see if I still liked it now as much as I did then. I found that while I could still appreciate how good some of Delaney's writing is, there were a fair number of things that annoyed me this second time that I didn't notice the first. Now, this may be because I was in an altered state of mind for much of that first reading, but I've also got a lot more life experience to draw on and a rather different perspective now. So today we're going to examine what makes Dhalgren an early example of a woke novel, as well as look at its strong points and its weaknesses. Samuel R. Delaney is noteworthy in part because he was an African American sci fi writer at a time when the overwhelming majority were white, and also because he was openly gay. He was named a Grand Master of the field. I believe that's from the Science Fiction Writers Association, but he's also attracted controversy for the content of his erotic non sci fi novels. From what I've heard of these, I don't have any interest in reading them, nor would I recommend them to anyone. And for a normie, I am pretty open minded about erotic content. For these and other reasons, I was conflicted about doing this review. I decided to do it anyway for a few reasons. First, I am totally against canceling a writer solely because of his or her opinions. Secondly, Dahlgren is now 50 years old, and it's a perfect example of the way that woke or leftist novels have changed, of that way that influence has played out over these decades. I'll also reference some of the other novels by Delaney as examples, by the way. Finally, I want to reiterate that the value of a work can be judged independent of the writer's politics. In his early career, Delaney was more of a conventional sci-fi writer, and he did write some fantasy. Those books were always a bit quirky, and in the mid-60s they got a lot quirkier. He's had some great titles, which is one of the things I appreciate. My favorite is Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones. Dahlgren was an experiment, a stereotypical hip countercultural novel that embodies many of the cliches of the era. It's very episodic. It's almost stream of consciousness. A lot happens, and you're not sure why, how it fits in the story arc, or even if there is a story arc. Of course, there's drug use, a lot of sex, no rock and roll, but there is some blues, so I appreciated that. And it's been compared to Joyce's Ulysses. The protagonist is called the Kid, because people assume he's a teenager, though he's actually in his 20s. It's also because he has amnesia and he can't remember his real name, though he does remember much of his life, including the fact that he's been in mental institutions. The setting is a fictional American city called Bologna, supposedly one of the top 10 in population, or rather, formerly one of the top 10, kind of like Detroit. Though the author doesn't specify its region, from the topography and the fact that it's on a river, I was thinking someplace like Cincinnati, maybe, somewhere in the Midwest, but doesn't matter. Bologna has recently undergone a mysterious disaster and is now cut off from the rest of the country. That is, there's no TV, there's no radio, telephone service doesn't work. Large parts of the city have burned, and most of the residents have fled. And now smoke and haze obscure the sky almost all the time, though when it does clear, people see these impossible and sometimes terrifying astronomical phenomena, such as a second moon or a sun that fills half the sky. Yet, this really has no effect other than kind of freaking people out. For some reason, the government never sends in the National Guard, as I think they would. And of course, people don't drive in at all. It must be that the roads are broken. I mean, I think that he says that the only way in is this pedestrian bridge, which is how Kid gets in, and you have to walk. As implausible as this setup seems, I think it's a metaphor for something, possibly for life in the ghetto. But Delaney did grow up in a middle-class black family. Whatever the faults of the idea, it does make an interesting premise. As the story begins, Kid is on his way into Bologna, not quite sure why he's going there. As soon as he's across that bridge, he begins to encounter the oddballs and quirky people who now populate the place. Of the original Bolognians who stayed, most are poor blacks who didn't have the wherewithal to leave. But there's also been a steady stream of hippies and other curiosity seekers. Kid acquires his nickname from a gay white biker type he meets early on. Says, "Hey, Kid, what are you doing?" Kid himself is half white and half Cherokee, and also bisexual. He acquires a boyfriend and a girlfriend at the same time, both of whom are white, a scrawny, barely literate teenager called Denny, and a smart, liberated 20-something woman named Lanya. He also finds a half-full notebook, the old-fashioned paper kind, and begins to write poetry, free verse mainly, and his poetry and the mystery surrounding him make him a celebrity in this now small community. It's an interesting narrative, and all sorts of odd things happen to Kid in his struggle to rediscover himself and to make sense of his interesting polyamorous relationship. Delaney's prose is wonderful, very descriptive without being pretentious. I was struck with how he could make very simple words very evocative. For example, he calls something the gray green of clay, which took me right back to my junior high school art class. And I hadn't thought about that in a long time. I did enjoy the bizarre and quirky characters and the weird community that they've improvised. Bologna has a newspaper published by an eccentric recluse who lives in a mansion guarded by gang members. He promotes the arts, including kids' poetry. He throws wild parties, and he prints crazy random dates on the paper's masthead, such as 1879 or 2007 or 1962. People make do. Taking over abandoned buildings, they subsist on canned food. They start their own schools. There's a bizarre street gang called the Scorpions. No, it's not the rock band. For their night raids, they have these cool hollow projectors that make them look like dragons or lions or griffins or giant spiders. On their wrists, they wear curved, multi-bladed gizmos called orchids. As weapons, they are stylish but kind of impractical. I would call them cyberpunk before there was cyberpunk. As I noted, the story doesn't really go anywhere. Here's a spoiler. Kid never remembers his name. Though I've always had the theory that his real name is in fact William Dahlgren. Because why is the title that? There was a list of names in the notebook, and William Dahlgren was one of them. I've also had the theory that he actually wrote that list and everything else in the book because he's schizophrenic and he just doesn't remember doing it. He does have all these lapses of memory throughout the story. The second time through, I specifically noted all the elements that jive with progressive ideology. That's not surprising because Delaney calls himself a Marxist. He said so in a talk that I attended at a con in San Diego in the early 1990s. In the Q&A period, I was the smartass who said, "Haven't Marxist regimes been terribly intolerant of gay people?" His answer, "That's a good question," which probably is a polite way of saying, "You're a dick for bringing that up." But he went on to say, "None of the regimes, in my view, have been truly Marxist," which is kind of what you expect him to say. So, on that note, here are a few things from the book that stuck out as being what we would now consider to be culturally Marxist. First of all, Bologna is a remarkably peaceful place, which kind of goes with the leftist view that people are essentially good, rather than with the conservative view, which I maintain that people are wild animals who need to be tamed. You'd expect, with no police or courts and no new goods coming in, that people would be at each other's throats. No, there's plenty of canned food left in the abandoned homes and stores to sustain the small number of people there. And so they scavenge. And there's plenty of booze as well to keep them busy, but the cigarettes ran out a long time ago. Now, this being the 70s, I think that would have made people pretty edgy. But whatever, they are well behaved. The Scorpion Gang, despite being ruffians, are very egalitarian. Their members are black and white, male and female, straight and gay. That's all very kumbaya, but I can't imagine such a disparate group getting along for any length of time. and they're not actually all that violent. They mainly go around looting abandoned stores and scaring people, sometimes beating them up. Now, here are a few of the items that on the second read I found to be a bit insulting. The least well-adjusted people in Bologna are traditional white families. One in particular, the Richards, live in an apartment building that is mostly empty and pretend to lead normal lives. The father actually has a job, doing what we don't know, in a nearby engineering office. His wife refuses to acknowledge that the old Bologna is gone and wants to pretend that everything is the same as it always was. And he and the children play along with her. They don't leave even after one of the kids dies in a tragic accident. And speaking of being maladjusted, with one exception, the only truly senseless violence is perpetrated by white people. In one case, a scorpion loses his temper and accidentally beats one of the hippies to death. There's a group of white families holed up in a department store, friends of the Richards, of course, who keep shooting at intruders, even though the scorpions are actually pretty harmless. And of course, there's a dude who climbs a tower and starts picking people off with a rifle. If that's not a trope, what is? As I said, there's lots of sex, and the fact that some of it is gay is definitely a proto-woke thing. The thing I do appreciate about Delaney's sex scenes is that they're kind of matter of fact. They're not over dramatized. Neither are they super graphic, because we all know how this works. So you don't get these purple prose that you see in an erotic fantasy novel. Instead, Delaney might describe what Kid is thinking as he's doing the deed, or the feeling of the grass as they're lying down on it, or the dry skin of his partner. Though unconventional relationships are a staple of progressive fiction, this book came out before it was all supposed to be uniformly positive. So some of the sex that happens is pretty degrading, for example. And here's an interesting thing. Despite the implausible idea that birth control is still widely available, Melania mentions having to go raid a drugstore to get some pills, some of the women do get pregnant, and so at least that is realistic. The exception to the progressive mantra that any love is good love is, of course, toxic masculinity, and this novel has that too, in the form of a big black guy called George Harrison. He's infamous for having assaulted a teenage white girl right out in the open on the night of the big storm that started the Bologna disaster. Here is the problem with that, as I see it. He never repents or pays for this crime. In fact, most of the people seem to regard him as kind of a folk hero rather than a rapist. And he tells Kid that the girl secretly wanted it and he would do it again given the chance. As I'm always saying, this could not be put in a modern sci-fi novel, but for once that's a good thing. Now, as much as I hated this part, I did accept it because Bologna has to have a dark side, no pun intended. But the thing that bugged me most is that this character shared the name of my favorite Beatle. Dhalgren is a wild ride, but here's the problem. What does it all mean? I've read that Delaney wanted to talk about mental illness because he himself has had issues with that, and about all the burned out ghettos in America's cities, but it doesn't explain the events of the stories. Why do all these weirdos and misfits keep coming to Bologna, even though it's falling apart? And what will become of the place? What does Kid learn from all of this? He becomes passionate about poetry, but gives it up to run with the Scorpions. He loves both Lanya and Danny, but in the end, spoiler alert, he abandons them as he leaves Bologna without even saying goodbye. Now, I felt a lot of sympathy for these three characters, but in the end, I didn't get any closure. Besides Dahlgren, the Delaney books that I've read have kept most of these crazy sex themes, though at least the stories are somewhat more linear. In the Einstein intersection, 1967, the radiation of a nuclear war has created a third sex, and the government tells everyone to have lots of partners to reduce the impact of mutations. In the book Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand, that's a wonderful title, 1984, there's a gay bathhouse that welcomes dragons, but we assume it's male dragons only. In Triton, 1976, a man undergoes a sex change because he thinks it's the only way that he, now she, can ever find true love, although we never discover whether or not that plan works because the book ends soon after that. And another thing, in more than one Delaney book, there's a character who goes around naked all the time just because. I have read several of Delaney's books from this period, from 1966, Fable 17, to 1984, because Delaney is a talented writer who envisions interesting, fascinating worlds and weird, unusual characters. His works were a welcome change from the more conventional, normal, mainstream sci-fi that I was typically reading. At this point, that hadn't become old hat yet. You didn't expect every other protagonist to be gay. Perhaps that's why I also later lost interest in his stuff, because it was no longer unique. Plus, a lot of his later work was purely erotic, and I didn't like what I was hearing about this stuff. The euphemism that Wikipedia used about it was transgressive. On the positive side, none of the Delaney books that I've read have the obvious underlying air of grievance that we often see these days in books by diverse writers. In other words, everything is the fault of colonialism, or white people, or the patriarchy. A good example of this is R.F. Kuang's Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, which I reviewed around a year ago. I'll be analyzing another such book in a couple weeks, so stay tuned for that. Now, I am definitely not condemning non-white writers as a group. I think we get these books because that's what the publishers want them to write. And why, I don't know, because I don't think most readers want that. As for Dahlgren, I'm not going to recommend this book because most normies are going to hate it. And at minimum, they won't get it. Those of you who do appreciate quirky characters, lots of unconventional sex, and don't mind a mystifying story with an unreliable narrator will probably like it. Though if you can make sense of it, you're a smarter person than I am. If not, this book is not for you. Even sci-fi writers cannot agree. William Gibson praised it, saying, Dahlgren is a mystery not meant to be solved. Harlan Ellison called it a waste of time that was too boring to finish. This has been my review of the 1975 novel Dhalgren by Samuel R. Delaney. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Please also like and subscribe and check out my works on Amazon. Links are in the description as always. They're not going to be nearly as unconventional as Delaney's, but one of my books does have a gay protagonist. For now, this is the Steampunk Desperado saying adios amigos from the Steampunk Desperado channel, where the past meets the future and the present is extraordinary.